A farmer saves Jaguar cubs from a dangerous drug cartel, thinking he's done a good deed. But the next morning, DEA Black Hawks circle his farm, and what they reveal changes everything. Miguel Reyes wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as the merciless Colombian sun beat down on his shoulders. At 53, his once black hair was now streaked with silver, but his body remained as strong and lean as it had been during his 20 years with the Colombian Special Forces. Those days were long behind him now. These days, his battles were fought against stubborn soil and unpredictable weather, not against the enemies of his country. His small farm sat nestled in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, the highest coastal mountain range in the world. The location was remote, precisely why Miguel had chosen it after leaving his military life behind. Here, among the dense rainforest and steep mountain slopes, he had found a peace he never thought possible after decades of violence and conflict. "Señor Miguel!" The frantic voice of Tomas, his 17-year-old farmhand, cut through his thoughts. The boy was running toward him from the edge of the property, his thin frame moving with urgency. Miguel straightened, immediately alert. Years of training had hardened certain instincts into permanence. "What is it, Tomas?" "In the forest," the boy panted, pointing toward the dense tree line that marked the boundary of Miguel's property. "I saw men, with guns, and they have animals, jaguars, I think, in cages." Miguel's eyes narrowed. Poachers were common in these parts, but armed men with captive jaguars suggested something more organized. The black market for exotic animals was booming, and jaguars, especially cubs, fetched extraordinary prices. "How many men did you see?" Miguel asked, his voice dropping to the quiet, controlled tone he had used when commanding missions in another life. "4, maybe 5, Tomas replied, still catching his breath. "They have trucks. They're setting up some kind of camp just beyond the ridge." Miguel nodded, his mind already calculating distances, terrain advantages, potential threats, old habits. "Go back to the house, Tomas. Stay there until I return." "But, Señor—" "Now, Tomas." The tone left no room for argument. The boy hesitated, but then nodded and headed back toward the small farmhouse. Miguel returned to his own home quickly, entering through the back door and moving directly to what appeared to be a simple wooden cabinet in his bedroom. His fingers found a hidden latch, and the false back swung open to reveal a small arsenal: 2 pistols, a hunting rifle, and a military-grade combat knife. Equipment he had hoped never to use again, but was too practical, too experienced to discard. As he methodically checked the weapons, memories flooded back. The operations in the jungle, the firefights with FARC guerrillas, the covert missions that officially never happened. But most of all, he remembered his final mission, the one that had led him to abandon his military career and seek solitude in these mountains. Miguel pushed the thoughts away. That was the past. This was about protecting his land and stopping whatever illegal activity was occurring on his doorstep. Nothing more. Properly armed and dressed in dark green clothing that would blend with the forest, Miguel slipped out of his house and into the dense vegetation. His movements were silent, methodical, muscle memory from years of jungle warfare guiding every step. He moved like a ghost through the underbrush, leaving no trace of his passing. It took him nearly 40 minutes to reach the ridge Tomas had mentioned. Dropping to his stomach, Miguel crawled the final few meters to the edge and peered down into the small valley beyond. What he saw made his blood run cold. Below him, a temporary camp had indeed been established. 2 large trucks were parked in a clearing, and around them moved several heavily armed men. Their weapons weren't the hunting rifles of poachers, but military-grade automatic weapons. Their movements displayed the practiced efficiency of trained combatants. But what confirmed Miguel's worst fears were the insignias visible on some of their equipment. He recognized them immediately: Los Rastrojos, one of Colombia's most notorious drug cartels. In the center of the camp, 6 metal cages had been arranged. Inside 5 of them, Miguel could see the black and gold spotted forms of jaguar cubs, each no larger than a house cat. The animals paced their tiny prisons, obviously distressed. The 6th cage contained something that made Miguel's jaw clench. An adult female jaguar, likely the mother, sedated, but still alive. Miguel understood immediately what he was seeing. The cartel was diversifying. Using the same smuggling routes they had established for cocaine, they were now trafficking exotic animals to wealthy collectors around the world. The jaguar cubs would be worth a fortune, and the mother would likely be killed once she was no longer needed. As a young soldier, Miguel had been part of anti-trafficking operations. He knew the brutal economics at play. A single jaguar cub could sell for as much as $50,000 on the black market. 5 cubs represented a significant payday, even for a cartel used to dealing in millions. One of the men approached the cages, prodding at the sedated mother with the barrel of his rifle. The animal didn't respond, but one of the cubs hissed and swatted its tiny paw at the man. He laughed and pointed his weapon at the defiant cub. Miguel's hand instinctively tightened around his pistol. The logical part of his mind told him to retreat, to call the authorities and let them handle this. But logic was drowned out by something more primal. He had come to these mountains to escape violence, to live in harmony with the land and its creatures. These men had brought that violence to his doorstep. And there was another factor, one Miguel couldn't ignore. The nearest police station was over 2 hours away, and corruption was rampant. By the time any official response arrived, if it arrived at all, the smugglers would be long gone, taking the jaguars with them. Decision made, Miguel began to work his way around the perimeter of the camp, studying the layout, counting men, noting positions. 8 cartel members in total, all armed. The odds weren't good, but Miguel had faced worse in his time. As he completed his reconnaissance, a 9th man emerged from one of the trucks. Unlike the others, he wore no visible weapons. Instead, he was dressed in expensive clothing that seemed out of place in the jungle setting. He gestured animatedly as he spoke, clearly giving orders that the others rushed to obey. Miguel recognized the type immediately. Not a soldier, but a handler. Someone who managed the business side of the operation. The man moved to the cages, inspecting the cubs with the calculating eye of someone assessing merchandise. When he reached the cage containing the mother jaguar, he frowned and turned to one of the armed men, saying something Miguel couldn't hear. The armed man nodded, raised his rifle, and aimed it at the sedated animal. Miguel knew he was out of time. The decision to act was no longer a choice, but a necessity. He took a deep breath, calming his mind as he had been trained to do before combat. Then, with practiced precision, he brought his rifle to his shoulder, took aim, and fired. The shot echoed through the valley like thunder, and chaos erupted in the camp below. The bullet struck the cartel man's rifle, sending it flying from his hands. The man howled in pain, clutching his numbed fingers as the weapon clattered to the ground. Miguel had aimed not to kill, but to disarm. His first instinct still to minimize casualties. That mercy would be short-lived. The camp exploded into action. The cartel members dove for cover, weapons raised, scanning the tree line for the source of the shot. The handler ducked behind one of the trucks, shouting orders in rapid-fire Spanish. "Find him! Whoever it is, bring me their head!" Miguel was already moving, sliding away from his firing position and circling through the dense undergrowth. Never stay in place after revealing your position, one of the first rules of guerrilla warfare. He could hear the cartel men crashing through the forest, their movements loud and undisciplined compared to his silent progress. Miguel needed to even the odds quickly. In an extended firefight, numbers would eventually tell. He circled behind one of the men who had ventured too far from the group, moving alone through the forest with his weapon raised. Miguel approached silently from behind, then struck, one arm wrapping around the man's neck in a practiced chokehold, the other hand clamping over his mouth. The struggle was brief. When the man went limp, Miguel zip-tied his hands and feet, then moved on. 7 left. Back at the camp, confusion reigned. 2 men remained with the cages, guarding the valuable cargo. The handler had retreated to one of the trucks, shouting into a satellite phone. The other 4 were spread out in the forest, hunting for the unseen attacker. Miguel needed to separate them further. He withdrew a small radio transmitter from his pocket, another relic from his military days, and activated it some distance from his position. The burst of static immediately drew the attention of 2 of the searchers, who converged on the sound. As they approached the source of the noise, Miguel emerged from behind a massive ceiba tree and fired twice. The first shot caught one man in the thigh, the second struck the other's shoulder. Both collapsed, wounded but alive. Miguel quickly secured them with more zip ties and confiscated their weapons. He had no interest in killing these men if it could be avoided. 5 remaining. Miguel circled back toward the camp, moving even more cautiously now. The element of surprise was fading, and the remaining cartel members would be increasingly alert. As he approached the edge of the clearing, he could see the 2 guards standing tensely by the cages, their weapons pointed outward toward the forest. The sedated mother jaguar had begun to stir in her cage, perhaps roused by the commotion. Her cubs mewed pitifully, sensing their mother's distress. Miguel needed a distraction. From his pocket, he withdrew a handful of small metal objects, homemade caltrops fashioned from nails that he kept for wild boar hunting. With a practiced flick of his wrist, he sent them scattering across the far side of the clearing, where they landed with a subtle metallic clinking. The sound was enough. Both guards turned toward the noise, momentarily directing their attention away from Miguel's position. It was all the opening he needed. He burst from the tree line, covering the distance to the first guard in seconds. Before the man could react, the butt of Miguel's rifle connected with his temple, sending him crumpling to the ground. The second guard managed to turn, raising his weapon, but Miguel was already too close. A swift strike to the man's wrist disarmed him, and a follow-up blow to the solar plexus left him gasping on the ground. 3 left. 2 searchers in the forest and the handler in the truck. Miguel secured the downed guards, then turned his attention to the cages. The mother jaguar was now fully awake, her golden eyes fixed on Miguel with primal wariness. The cubs had retreated to the far corners of their cages, hissing and spitting at this new human intruder. "Easy," Miguel murmured in a low, soothing voice. "I'm not here to hurt you." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted him. One of the remaining searchers was returning to the camp, likely drawn by the commotion. Miguel slipped behind one of the trucks, waiting. The cartel man emerged from the forest cautiously, his rifle sweeping the seemingly empty camp. When he spotted his fallen comrades, he froze for a split second, all the time Miguel needed. He lunged from his hiding place, tackling the man to the ground. They grappled briefly, but Miguel's experience told. A precise strike to the back of the neck, and the man went still. 2 left. The last searcher would be more difficult. He would have heard the struggle and would approach with extreme caution, and the handler remained unaccounted for. Miguel quickly checked the first truck. Empty. Moving to the second, he found the handler attempting to squeeze himself under the dashboard, the satellite phone still clutched in his hand. Seeing Miguel, the man raised his hands in immediate surrender. "Please, I'm just a businessman. I don't even carry a weapon." Miguel pulled him roughly from the truck. "Where's your last man?" The handler's eyes darted nervously. "Felipe? He went north toward the river. Please, I can pay you. Whatever you want." A shot rang out, the bullet striking the truck mere inches from Miguel's head. Both he and the handler dove for cover as more shots followed. The final cartel member had returned and was firing from the edge of the forest. Miguel, shielded behind the truck's engine block, calculated his options. The shooter was well positioned, with clear lines of sight to both trucks. Any attempt to return fire would expose Miguel to danger, but the man had made one critical error. In focusing entirely on Miguel, he had positioned himself with his back to the deeper forest, assuming no threat would come from that direction. It was a fatal mistake. A dark shadow detached itself from the forest behind the shooter, Tomas, the farmhand who had evidently disobeyed Miguel's order to stay at the house. Moving with surprising stealth, the boy swung a heavy branch with all his might, connecting solidly with the back of the gunman's head. The man pitched forward, unconscious before he hit the ground. "I told you to stay at the house," Miguel said as the boy approached, though there was no real anger in his voice. Tomas shrugged, a slight smile playing on his lips. "You're welcome, senor." With all threats neutralized, Miguel returned his attention to the cages. The adult jaguar watched him warily as he approached, her powerful muscles tensed beneath her spotted coat. He had to move quickly. The tranquilizers were wearing off, and a fully alert jaguar, especially a mother separated from her cubs, was not something anyone should face in close quarters. "We need to transport these cages to the farm," Miguel told Tomas, who nodded and began helping him load the heavy metal containers onto one of the cartel's trucks. The handler, secured with his own zip ties, watched from where Miguel had left him propped against a tree. "You have no idea what you're doing," the man said, his initial fear giving way to contempt. "Do you know who I work for? They'll come looking for me, and when they find you—" "Be quiet," Miguel said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that silenced the handler immediately. As they worked, Miguel inspected the cages more closely. The cubs were all alive, though clearly frightened and dehydrated. The mother was regaining more of her strength by the minute, her massive paws kneading restlessly at the floor of her cage. While securing the cages in the truck, Miguel noticed something unusual. Hidden beneath the mother jaguar's cage was a small, waterproof container. Inside, he found several plastic-wrapped packages that he recognized immediately from his military days. Cocaine, at least 5 kilograms worth. "Look at this, Tomas," Miguel said, showing the boy his discovery. Tomas's eyes widened. "The jaguars were just a cover?" Miguel shook his head. "Not a cover, a bonus. The cartels never miss an opportunity to profit. They were likely using the same routes and vehicles for both operations." With the cages loaded and secured, Miguel addressed their human prisoners. The wounded had been given basic first aid, and all were bound securely. "What do we do with them, senor?" Tomas asked. Miguel considered the question. Involving the local police was risky. Corruption was endemic, and there was no guarantee the cartel members would face justice. But he couldn't simply execute them in cold blood, regardless of their crimes. "We leave them," he decided finally. "Secured but alive. We'll take their weapons and vehicles. Someone will find them eventually." "And him?" Tomas nodded toward the handler, who glared back defiantly. Miguel studied the man thoughtfully. Unlike the others, the handler would have valuable information: names, locations, details of the cartel's operations. "He comes with us," Miguel said. "I want to know exactly what we've stumbled into." As they prepared to depart, Miguel discovered one final, crucial piece of evidence: a leather-bound ledger in the handler's possession, filled with dates, locations, and coded entries. He tucked it securely into his jacket. With Tomas driving the truck containing the jaguars, and Miguel following in the second vehicle with their reluctant passenger, they began the journey back to the farm. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in gold and crimson as they wound their way down the narrow dirt roads. What had begun as a simple intervention to save endangered animals had evolved into something far more complicated. Miguel knew that by interfering with a cartel operation, he had painted a target on his back. But as he glanced at the cages in the truck ahead, at the mother jaguar's eyes meeting his through the bars, he couldn't bring himself to regret his actions. Little did he know that the ledger tucked inside his jacket would prove to be far more valuable and dangerous than he could possibly imagine. Night had fully descended by the time the two trucks rumbled up the dirt road leading to Miguel's farm. The headlights carved yellow tunnels through the darkness, illuminating the modest single-story farmhouse and the small barn behind it. The place wasn't much. A few hectares of cultivated land, some livestock and the surrounding forest, but it was his. A sanctuary built far from the violence that had defined his earlier life. Until today. Miguel parked his truck beside Thomas's and cut the engine. In the sudden silence, he could hear the soft growls of the Jaguars from the other vehicle. The handler sat in sullen silence beside him, hands still bound behind his back. "Welcome to your new home," Miguel said dryly, "at least for tonight." The handler's only response was a contemptuous snort. Tomas was already out of his truck, looking expectantly at Miguel. "Where should we put them, senor? The Jaguars, I mean." Miguel considered the question. The barn would have to do. It was secure enough to hold the cages temporarily, and his 2 milk cows could spend the night in the outer paddock. "The barn," he decided. "Help me clear space." They worked quickly, moving farm equipment and feed sacks to make room for the cages. The mother Jaguar was now fully alert, pacing the confines of her prison with restless energy. Her cubs mewed and chirped, responding to their mother's distress. With the barn prepared, Miguel turned his attention to their human prisoner. He secured the handler to a sturdy wooden chair in the main room of the farmhouse, positioning him where he could be watched from the kitchen. "Tomas," Miguel said, "bring water for the Jaguars, then go home. Your mother will be worried." The boy hesitated. "But senor, what about—" "I'll handle everything else. You've done enough for today." Miguel's tone was gentle but firm. "And Tomas? Tell no one what happened. Not even your family, understand?" Tomas nodded reluctantly. "Si, Senor Miguel." After the boy had departed, Miguel retrieved the leather-bound ledger from his jacket and placed it on the kitchen table. Then he filled a glass with water and approached the handler. "Drink," he said, holding the glass to the man's lips. The handler drank greedily, water spilling down his expensive shirt. When he finished, he looked up at Miguel with calculating eyes. "You're making a terrible mistake," he said. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "No," Miguel replied honestly. "But I know what you are. That's enough." He pulled a chair across from the handler and sat, studying him with the patient gaze of a man who had conducted many interrogations in his time. "Let's start with something simple. Your name." The handler smiled thinly. "Javier Mendoza, though I doubt that means anything to you." Miguel showed no reaction, though the name was indeed familiar from his military days. Mendoza was a mid-level operative in the Los Rastrojos cartel, known for his business acumen rather than brutality. That he was personally overseeing this operation suggested it was more significant than a simple animal smuggling scheme. "The Jaguars," Miguel continued. "Where were they headed?" Mendoza shrugged as much as his restraints allowed. "Private collectors. There's a growing market for exotic pets among the nouveau riche in China, the Emirates, even the United States. The big cats fetch particularly high prices." "And the cocaine? Same destination?" A flicker of surprise crossed Mendoza's face before he could mask it. "You found that too, did you? Efficient." Miguel leaned forward. "The ledger. What's in it?" At this, Mendoza's demeanor changed subtly. The arrogance in his eyes gave way to something more cautious, more calculating. "Shipping manifests. Nothing that would interest you." Miguel knew a lie when he heard one. He stood and retrieved the ledger from the kitchen table, opening it as he returned to his seat. The pages were filled with columns of numbers, dates, and coded entries. Some were clearly related to drug shipments, quantities, prices, locations, but interspersed among these were entries that seemed out of place. Project Jaguar, asset acquisition, diplomatic channels. "This is more than drug running," Miguel said, looking up from the ledger. "What is Project Jaguar?" Mendoza's face had gone completely still. "I would advise you to forget you ever saw that name." "That's not an answer. It's the only one you'll get from me." A cold smile spread across Mendoza's face. "You know what will happen now, don't you? My men were supposed to check in every 3 hours. When they don't, more will come looking. Many more. And they won't be as professionally restrained as you were today." Miguel knew the threat wasn't idle. Cartel enforcers would indeed come, and in numbers he couldn't hope to defeat alone. But there was something in Mendoza's eyes, not just confidence, but a particular kind of eagerness that suggested he was counting on their arrival soon. Very soon. Miguel stood abruptly. "Excuse me a moment." He stepped outside, the cool night air a welcome relief from the tension inside. The barn was quiet now, the Jaguars having settled somewhat. Stars speckled the clear sky above, the same stars he had navigated by during countless jungle operations. This situation was deteriorating rapidly. Miguel had intended to contact the proper authorities in the morning, perhaps the environmental police, who were generally less corrupt than the regular force. But Mendoza's reaction to the ledger, combined with his confidence about an imminent rescue, suggested that waiting until morning would be a fatal mistake. Miguel needed help, and there was only one person he could trust completely. He pulled an old flip phone from his pocket, not his regular cell, but a prepaid model he kept for emergencies. The number he dialed was one he hadn't called in years, but had never forgotten. It rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. "Who is this?" "It's Phantasma," Miguel said, using his old call sign from their shared military days. A pause. "Miguel? Christ, it's been what, 5 years, 6? 7, I need your help, Carlos." Colonel Carlos Ortega had been Miguel's commanding officer in the Special Forces, and later his contact when Miguel had worked in military intelligence. Now, if Miguel's information was correct, Ortega served as the primary liaison between the Colombian military and the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. "What kind of trouble are you in?" Ortega asked, his voice instantly serious. Miguel explained the situation concisely: the Jaguar rescue, the captured cartel operative, the cocaine, and most significantly, the ledger, with its mysterious references to Project Jaguar. "Project Jaguar?" Ortega repeated, his voice suddenly tight. "You're absolutely certain that's what it said?" "Yes." "What is it, Carlos?" A long pause. "Not over the phone. Listen to me very carefully, Miguel. That ledger may be the most important piece of intelligence we've seen in years. You need to secure it, and Mendoza, until we can reach you." "We?" "I'm bringing in the DEA. This goes beyond Colombia now." Miguel frowned. "How long?" "I can have a helicopter there by dawn. 6 hours, maybe 7. "Can you hold out that long?" Miguel thought of Mendoza's confidence, the implied timeline of the cartel's response. "I'm not sure. I think they might be coming sooner than that." "Then prepare yourself," Ortega said grimly. "Use whatever resources you have. Create defensive positions. You remember the protocols for a defensive hold against superior numbers?" "I remember." "Good. And Miguel, that ledger doesn't leave your possession, no matter what happens, understand?" "Understood." After ending the call, Miguel stood motionless for a moment, processing the implications. Whatever Project Jaguar was, it had clearly alarmed Ortega, a man not easily shaken. Back inside the house, Miguel found Mendoza exactly as he'd left him, that same cold smile still playing on his lips. "Made your peace with God?" Mendoza asked mockingly. Miguel didn't respond directly. Instead, he pulled a small digital camera from a drawer and began photographing every page of the ledger, creating a backup of the information in case the original was lost or destroyed. "You know," Mendoza continued conversationally, "there's still a way out of this for you. Return the ledger and myself unharmed, and my employers might be persuaded to show mercy." Miguel looked up from his task. "I've met your kind before, Mendoza. I know exactly how much your mercy is worth." "Perhaps," but I don't think you understand what you're now involved in. This is bigger than you can imagine. Governments, intelligence agencies, the kind of people who can make a man disappear without leaving so much as a ripple. Miguel finished photographing the ledger and tucked the camera's memory card into a hidden pocket in his boot. Then he checked his watch. If Ortega was right, he had 6 to 7 hours before help arrived, but judging from Mendoza's demeanor, the cartel's response would come much sooner. He needed to prepare. From a locked cabinet, Miguel retrieved additional ammunition for his weapons. Then he systematically moved through the house, closing shutters, barricading doors, creating firing positions at key windows. It was a routine he had performed countless times in the field, transforming ordinary buildings into defensible positions. But as he worked, a nagging thought persisted. What could be in that ledger that would prompt such an urgent response from both the cartel and Ortega? What was Project Jaguar? Whatever it was, Miguel had a sinking feeling that the simple act of rescuing those Jaguar cubs had dragged him into something far more dangerous than a cartel animal smuggling operation. And dawn was still many hours away. The mother jaguar's low growl resonated through the barn as Miguel approached with fresh water and raw meat he'd retrieved from his freezer. Her golden eyes tracked his every movement, filled with primal intelligence and unmistakable hostility. The cubs, however, displayed more curiosity than fear, pressing their spotted faces against the bars of their cages. "Easy, girl," Miguel murmured, setting down the supplies just within reach of her cage. "I'm not your enemy." The big cat snarled in response, revealing impressive canines that could easily crush bone. Miguel maintained a respectful distance. He'd encountered jaguars in the wild during his military days, Colombia's apex predator, capable of taking down caimans and anacondas. Beautiful, powerful, and utterly dangerous when threatened, much like the situation he now found himself in. After ensuring the jaguars had water and food, Miguel returned to the farmhouse. Mendoza remained secured to the chair, watching Miguel with the same calculating patience the jaguar had displayed. "They'll be here within the hour," Mendoza said casually, as if discussing the arrival of dinner guests rather than cartel killers. "My personal security detail travels with GPS trackers. Standard procedure." Miguel ignored the taunt and checked his watch. It was just past midnight. Even if Mendoza was bluffing about the timeline, cartel reinforcements would certainly arrive long before Ortega's promised helicopter at dawn. He needed to prepare the battlefield. Military training had taught Miguel that superior numbers could be offset by preparation, position, and the element of surprise. The cartel would expect to find a simple farmer, perhaps with a hunting rifle at best. They wouldn't be prepared for the tactics of a special forces veteran, fighting on terrain he knew intimately. Miguel gathered what he needed from around the farm: fishing line, small bells, flares, homemade caltrops, and other improvised materials. Working methodically, he began setting up an early warning system around the perimeter of his property. Tripwires connected to noisemakers would alert him to intruders. Strategic placement of obstacles would funnel attackers into predetermined kill zones. As he worked, Miguel reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. 7 years ago, he had walked away from the military after a classified operation went catastrophically wrong. The details remained heavily redacted in official reports, but the nightmares that still occasionally plagued his sleep were vivid enough. He had come to this remote farm seeking peace, seeking to forget. Now, violence had found him again. After completing the perimeter defenses, Miguel returned to the house to find Mendoza dozing in his chair. The cartel handler jerked awake as Miguel entered. "Tell me about Project Jaguar," Miguel said without preamble, setting his rifle against the wall. Mendoza blinked away sleep. "Why are you so interested in that particular entry?" "Because it made my former commanding officer very nervous, and he doesn't scare easily." A slow smile spread across Mendoza's face. "Ah, so you've called for help. Military?" or perhaps DEA. It doesn't matter. They won't arrive in time. Miguel pulled up a chair, sitting directly in front of his prisoner. I have the ledger. I have you. I rescued the Jaguars. I've already disrupted whatever operation you had planned. Why not tell me what I'm involved in? Mendoza studied Miguel for a long moment, as if reassessing him. You're not just some farmer, are you? Military background, obviously. Special forces, I'd guess, from the way you handled my men. Intelligence training, too, from your interrogation technique. He tilted his head. What was your name? Your real name in your previous life? Miguel remained silent. It doesn't matter, Mendoza continued. But I'm curious. Why would a man with your skills choose to become a farmer in the middle of nowhere? Running from something? Or someone? Before Miguel could respond, a soft chime sounded from outside, one of his perimeter alarms. He was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, moving to the window. In the pale moonlight, he could make out dark figures moving at the edge of the forest, approximately 200 meters from the house. He counted at least 6, possibly more hidden by the trees. They moved with the coordinated precision of trained operatives, not the chaotic aggression of typical cartel enforcers. Right on schedule, Mendoza remarked, a note of satisfaction in his voice. Miguel turned from the window. How many? Enough. Miguel secured a gag around Mendoza's mouth. He couldn't risk the handler calling out to his men, then moved quickly through the house, extinguishing all lights. In darkness, he returned to his observation position. The intruders had split into 3 teams, approaching from different directions. Their movement patterns suggested military or paramilitary training. These weren't ordinary cartel thugs, but specialized enforcers, the kind deployed for high-value operations. Miguel calculated his options. He was outnumbered at least 6-1, facing trained opponents. Direct confrontation would be suicide. But he had advantages too. Intimate knowledge of the terrain, prepared defensive positions, and the element of surprise. They would expect to find their quarry cowering in fear, not a prepared adversary with combat experience. When the first team breached his outer perimeter, Miguel was ready. From his concealed position in a shallow depression 30 meters from the house, he observed 3 men advancing cautiously toward the darkened building. They communicated via hand signals, their weapons held at the ready. Miguel waited until they triggered his second alarm, a nearly invisible tripwire connected to a series of small bells hidden in the underbrush. The soft tinkling sound was barely audible, but it caused the 3 men to freeze momentarily, suddenly alert to the possibility of traps. That hesitation was all Miguel needed. He squeezed the trigger 3 times in rapid succession. 3 silenced shots, 3 targets down, non-lethal wounds to legs and shoulders that would incapacitate without killing. Before the men could respond, Miguel was already moving to a new position, keeping low and using the darkness for cover. The second team, hearing their comrades' muffled cries, rushed forward with less caution, directly into one of Miguel's prepared kill zones. When they triggered the buried pressure plate Miguel had improvised from an old scale, the area erupted in blinding light as multiple flares ignited simultaneously. Temporarily blinded, the cartel operators made perfect targets. Miguel fired twice more, taking down 2 of the 3-man team. The third managed to dive for cover behind an old tractor and began returning fire, forcing Miguel to retreat toward the barn. Inside, the Jaguars had been agitated by the commotion. The mother paced her cage restlessly, growling at the sounds of conflict outside. The cubs huddled together, their spotted coats seeming to shimmer in the dim light filtering through the barn's windows. Miguel positioned himself near the barn entrance, using the thick wooden door for cover. Through a narrow gap, he could observe the main house and the surrounding area. The third team of cartel operators had reached the farmhouse and was likely discovering their bound comrade inside. His suspicions were confirmed moments later when Mendoza emerged from the house, supported by 2 armed men. Even from a distance, Miguel could see the handler's face twisted with rage as he barked orders to his rescuers. More concerning was what followed. 4 additional operators exited the tree line, moving with the practiced efficiency of an extraction team. They carried heavier weapons, automatic rifles, and what appeared to be a shoulder-mounted rocket launcher. Clearly, they had orders to recover both Mendoza and the ledger at any cost. The odds, already unfavorable, had just gotten significantly worse. Miguel's hand went to the satellite phone in his pocket. Ortega's helicopter was still hours away. Without reinforcements, his position would soon become untenable. But surrender wasn't an option. Not with the mysterious Project Jaguar at stake, whatever it was. A new plan formed in Miguel's mind. If he couldn't hold out until dawn, perhaps he could at least ensure the ledger's information reached the proper authorities. He retrieved the memory card containing the photographed ledger pages from his boot and slipped it into a small, waterproof container. Then he wrote a brief note explaining its significance and added Ortega's contact information. The question was how to get this vital intelligence out while he was surrounded by cartel operators. A soft noise behind him drew Miguel's attention. The mother Jaguar had gone silent and was watching him intently, her golden eyes reflecting what little light filtered into the barn. In that moment, an idea crystallized, desperate and risky, but potentially their only chance. Outside, Mendoza's voice cut through the night. "We know you're in the barn. You have 1 minute to surrender the ledger, or we burn it to the ground, with you inside." Time was running out. Miguel had to make his move now, but first, he needed to release the Jaguars. The mother Jaguar's ears flattened against her skull as Miguel approached her cage, her muscles tensing beneath her spotted coat. Her cubs watched with wide, frightened eyes, pressing themselves against the backs of their individual enclosures. "I know this isn't ideal," Miguel murmured, more to himself than the animals, "but we're out of options." He had seconds to execute his desperate plan. Outside, Mendoza's men were positioning themselves around the barn, their shadowy figures visible through gaps in the wooden walls. The smell of gasoline reached his nostrils. They weren't bluffing about burning the place down. Miguel moved quickly to the mother's cage first. The lock was secured with a heavy padlock, which he shot off with a silenced round from his pistol. The big cat recoiled at the sound, then growled low in her throat as Miguel swung the door open. For a heart-stopping moment, the Jaguar remained in her cage, golden eyes fixed on Miguel with predatory intensity. Then, with fluid grace, she leapt out, landing silently on the barn floor. Instead of attacking Miguel as he had half expected, she immediately moved to her cubs, sniffing at their cages and growling with increased agitation. Miguel understood. She wouldn't leave without her offspring. He quickly shot off the locks on the cubs' cages as well, backing away as the doors swung open. The young Jaguars hesitated, then scampered out to join their mother, clustered protectively around her legs. 30 seconds, Mendoza's voice called from outside. Then we light it up. Miguel positioned himself beside the barn's rear exit, then raised his rifle and fired 3 rapid shots through the front wall, not aimed at the cartel operators, but close enough to make them duck for cover. In the momentary confusion, he kicked open the rear door. "Go!" he shouted at the Jaguars, making a sudden, aggressive movement in their direction. The mother reacted instantly, baring her teeth in a snarl before bolting through the open door, her cubs racing behind her. As Miguel had hoped, their escape route took them directly through the position of the cartel team, covering the barn's rear. Shouts of surprise and alarm erupted as nearly 200 kilograms of startled, aggressive Jaguar burst into their midst. Gunshots followed, but in the darkness and confusion, Miguel doubted they'd hit anything. The big cats would be long gone into the familiar forest within seconds. Taking advantage of the distraction, Miguel slipped out the same exit, moving in the opposite direction from the Jaguars. He kept low, using the barn's shadow as cover as he made his way toward a dense patch of undergrowth 20 meters away. He'd almost reached it when a shout went up. "There, by the barn!" Miguel dove forward as bullets tore through the space he'd occupied a split second earlier. Landing hard, he rolled into the brush and kept moving, staying as low to the ground as possible. Behind him, the night erupted in flames as the barn caught fire, casting an orange glow across the property. The illumination would make movement more difficult, but it also created chaotic, dancing shadows he could use for concealment. Miguel worked his way toward the tree line, keeping the burning barn between himself and the main group of cartel operators. If he could reach the forest, he might be able to lose his pursuers and circle back to the road where Ortega's helicopter would eventually arrive. Gunfire continued sporadically, some directed at his last known position, some possibly at fleeing Jaguars. Miguel heard Mendoza shouting orders, his voice tight with fury. "Find him! The ledger is all that matters!" 20 meters to the tree line. 15. 10. A figure suddenly materialized from behind a tree directly in Miguel's path, one of the cartel operators he'd wounded earlier, now bandaged but mobile enough to pose a threat. The man raised his weapon, but Miguel was faster. A single shot, and the operator crumpled to the ground. The exchange revealed Miguel's position. More gunfire erupted, forcing him to change direction. Rather than making for the trees, he veered toward an irrigation ditch that ran along the eastern edge of his cultivated fields. Diving into the shallow trench, Miguel crawled rapidly through the muddy water, using the embankment for cover. The ditch would lead him to a small stream that eventually fed into the river, a potential escape route, but one that would take him away from the rendezvous point for Ortega's helicopter. A new sound cut through the chaos, the mechanical whir of rotors, not the heavy thump of a military helicopter, but the higher-pitched whine of a smaller craft. Miguel risked raising his head just enough to scan the sky. A sleek black helicopter was descending toward the burning property, its spotlight sweeping the ground. It wasn't Colombian military or DEA. This was a private craft, almost certainly cartel-owned. Reinforcements had arrived far sooner than Miguel had anticipated. The situation had just deteriorated from desperate to nearly impossible. Miguel continued along the ditch until he reached the stream. The water was knee-deep and flowing swiftly due to recent mountain rains. He waded in, wincing at the cold, and began moving downstream. Water would mask his scent and thermal signature, making him harder to track. Behind him, the helicopter had landed in the clearing near his burning barn. More cartel operators were disembarking, bringing the total force against him to at least 15, possibly more. They would establish a perimeter and begin a systematic search pattern, standard procedure for high-value target acquisition. Miguel needed to contact Ortega. The arrival of a cartel helicopter suggested this operation had resources and urgency beyond normal parameters, further confirming the significance of Project Jaguar. Finding a relatively sheltered spot beneath overhanging vegetation, Miguel withdrew his satellite phone. The screen illuminated his face with pale blue light as he dialed. "Ortega," came the immediate answer. "The situation has escalated," Miguel said without preamble, keeping his voice low. "Cartel forces are on site, at least 15 operators with air support. They're after the ledger." A sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Are you secure?" "Negative. I'm on the move. The ledger is with me, but they're closing in." Miguel paused, then added, "What exactly am I carrying, Carlos? What is Project Jaguar?" There was a moment of silence. Then Ortega spoke, his voice grim. "It's a deep-cover intelligence operation. Project Jaguar has operatives embedded at the highest levels of multiple cartels across Colombia, Venezuela, and Mexico. That ledger likely contains their identities and positions." Miguel's blood ran cold. "If the cartels get this information, it would be a death sentence for every undercover agent," Ortega finished. "And it would collapse anti-narcotics operations across the hemisphere. Years of work, hundreds of millions in resources, all gone." Now the scale of the response made sense. both from the cartel, desperate to recover the compromised intelligence, and from Ortega, equally desperate to secure it. "I've dispatched 2 Blackhawks with DEA tactical teams," Ortega continued. "ETA 90 minutes. Can you hold out?" Miguel scanned the darkened forest around him. The cartel helicopter's spotlight was sweeping methodically across his property, and he could see the flashlights of search teams beginning to spread out from the burning barn. "I'll do my best," he replied. "But be advised they have superior numbers and air support. Consider this location compromised." "Understood. New rendezvous coordinates being transmitted to your phone now. Head there if possible." The phone beeped as the coordinates came through, a location approximately 3 kilometers east, in a small clearing suitable for helicopter extraction. "I'll be there," Miguel said, though he had no idea how he would break through the tightening cordon of cartel operators between him and the extraction point. "One more thing," Ortega added. "If capture is imminent, you need to destroy that ledger. The names inside cannot fall into cartel hands. Whatever it takes, Miguel." "Understood." Miguel ended the call and pocketed the phone. The weight of his responsibility settled over him like a physical burden. The ledger he carried wasn't just a record of illegal activities. It was a list of men and women who had risked everything to infiltrate the cartels. People with families, with lives outside their dangerous covers. If those identities were exposed, the resulting bloodbath would be unprecedented. A shout from upstream jolted Miguel from his thoughts. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, reflecting off the water's surface. Search teams had found the ditch and were following his trail to the stream. Time to move. Miguel pushed off from his sheltered position, allowing the current to carry him swiftly downstream. The water was bitingly cold, but he ignored the discomfort, focusing instead on keeping his head above water while making as little noise as possible. Behind him, the search intensified. The cartel helicopter had repositioned, its spotlight now sweeping along the stream, seeking any sign of movement. Ahead, the forest grew denser, offering better concealment, but also more challenging terrain. Miguel had 3 kilometers to cover through enemy-controlled territory, with trained operators and air support hunting him. The ledger had to reach Ortega's team intact, or dozens of undercover agents would die. It was going to be a very long night. The stream carried Miguel deeper into the forest, its gentle current an ally in his escape. After several hundred meters, he pulled himself onto the muddy bank and paused to get his bearings. The burning barn was now just a distant orange glow, but he could still hear the whine of the cartel helicopter circling in search patterns. He checked the satellite phone, confirming the extraction coordinates Ortega had sent. The clearing was northeast of his current position, requiring him to cut across heavily forested terrain, an advantage for evasion, but a challenge for rapid movement. Miguel estimated it would take at least 45 minutes to reach the rendezvous point, leaving little margin for error before the DEA helicopters arrived. First, he needed to deal with his wet clothes. The night air was cool in the mountains, and hypothermia would be as deadly as any cartel bullet. From a waterproof pocket, Miguel retrieved a compact thermal blanket, another relic of his military days that he'd grabbed before fleeing the house. He wrapped it around his torso beneath his sodden shirt, its crinkly material unpleasant but effective at trapping body heat. Properly insulated, Miguel set off through the forest, moving as quickly as caution allowed. Years of working in Colombia's varied terrain had taught him how to traverse jungle environments efficiently, stepping on roots or rocks to avoid leaving obvious footprints, using natural features for navigation, maintaining awareness of wind direction to prevent carrying his scent to potential pursuers. 20 minutes into his journey, Miguel froze at the sound of voices ahead. Dropping to a crouch, he edged forward until he could make out a small clearing. 2 cartel operators stood smoking cigarettes, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. They were positioned on what appeared to be a game trail, one that offered the most direct route to the extraction coordinates. Miguel assessed his options. Going around would cost precious time. Taking out the guards might alert others to his location. Both choices carried significant risks. The decision was made for him when his satellite phone vibrated silently in his pocket. Backing away to a safe distance, he checked the message from Ortega. Extraction timeline accelerated. Black Hawk's ETA 40 minutes. Confirm status. Miguel grimaced. The compressed timeline eliminated the option of a lengthy detour. He would have to deal with the guards. Returning to his observation position, Miguel studied the cartel operators more carefully. They were talking casually, relaxed, clearly not expecting trouble at this remote outpost. Both carried automatic rifles, but their sidearms remained holstered, and their tactical awareness was minimal. They were focused on their conversation, rather than their surroundings. Moving silently through the underbrush, Miguel circled to approach from downwind. He retrieved a stone from the forest floor and tossed it into the brush on the opposite side of the clearing. The soft rustling drew the attention of both guards, who turned toward the sound. Miguel moved the instant their backs were turned. Crossing the distance in 3 silent strides, he struck the first guard at the base of the skull with the butt of his pistol. As the man crumpled, the second guard began to turn, alerted by the movement in his peripheral vision. Miguel drove his knee into the man's solar plexus, then followed with a precise strike to the throat that left the guard gasping and incapacitated. Both men were unconscious within seconds, without a shot fired or an alarm raised. Miguel quickly bound and gagged them using their own belts and bandanas, then dragged them into the underbrush where they wouldn't be immediately visible to any passing patrols. He appropriated one of their radios, which would allow him to monitor the cartel's communications. The radio crackled to life almost immediately. Checkpoint 3, report status, over. Miguel tensed. The guards he'd just neutralized were apparently due for a check-in. He had seconds to decide how to respond. Raising the radio to his lips, Miguel disguised his voice with a heavier accent than his own and replied, "Checkpoint 3, all clear. Thought we heard something in the brush, but it was just an animal. Over." A brief pause. "Copy that. Maintain position. The target is believed to be heading northeast. Be alert. Over." "Understood. Over and out." Miguel lowered the radio, relief washing over him. The deception had worked, at least temporarily. But it also confirmed his fears. The cartel had correctly anticipated his destination and was establishing a perimeter around the likely extraction point. The race was on. Miguel continued northeast, now moving at a faster pace. The captured radio occasionally burst to life with status reports from other checkpoints, providing valuable intelligence on the cartel's search patterns. They had established a rough perimeter with approximately 8 checkpoints, but the coverage was incomplete due to the challenging terrain and limited manpower. A gap existed in their line, a steep ravine that the cartel operators were skirting rather than traversing directly. It would be physically demanding, but it offered Miguel his best chance of breaking through undetected. As he approached the ravine, the distinctive sound of the cartel helicopter returned, growing louder by the second. Miguel pressed himself against the base of a large tree, using its trunk for concealment as the aircraft passed overhead. The helicopter's spotlight swept the forest floor less than 50 meters from his position, its powerful beam cutting through the canopy to illuminate the undergrowth below. For a tense moment, Miguel thought the light would reach him, but it continued past, searching elsewhere. The helicopter's presence confirmed another troubling reality. The cartel was committing significant resources to this operation, far beyond what would be expected for the recovery of a mid-level operative like Mendoza, or even the captured cocaine. The ledger was clearly their primary objective. Once the helicopter had passed, Miguel continued to the edge of the ravine. In the darkness, he could just make out the steep, rocky slope descending approximately 30 meters to a narrow creek bed below. Under normal circumstances, he would never attempt such a descent at night, but these were far from normal circumstances. Using the strap from his rifle as an improvised safety line secured around tree trunks, Miguel began the perilous climb down. Each foothold had to be tested before committing his weight, each handhold carefully selected to avoid loosening rocks that might give away his position. The work was slow, painstaking, and physically exhausting. Halfway down, disaster struck. A rock that had appeared solid suddenly gave way beneath Miguel's foot, sending a cascade of smaller stones tumbling noisily down the ravine. He froze, pressing himself against the slope as the echoes of falling rocks gradually faded. The radio at his belt crackled. "Anyone else hear that?" Sounded like rockfall near the ravine. "Probably just an animal," another voice responded. "But send a team to check it out anyway." Miguel cursed silently. His time advantage had just evaporated. With renewed urgency, he continued his descent, sacrificing stealth for speed. When he reached the bottom, his boots splashed into the shallow creek that ran through the ravine. Looking up, he could already see flashlight beams sweeping the ridge above as cartel operators moved to investigate the noise. Checking his watch, Miguel calculated he had approximately 20 minutes to reach the extraction point before the DEA helicopters arrived. The distance was less than a kilometer now, but with cartel forces converging on his position, it might as well have been 100. The creek offered his best option. Following it downstream would eventually lead to a position near the extraction coordinates, and the water would help mask his trail. Miguel began moving rapidly through the ankle-deep water, staying close to the ravine wall where shadows provided additional concealment. Behind him, voices echoed down from the ridge. The cartel operators had reached the point where he'd begun his descent. It wouldn't take them long to deduce his route. "He went down into the ravine," a voice called out, confirming Miguel's fears. "Call it in. I want teams at both ends of this creek bed now." The radio at Miguel's belt erupted with a flurry of orders as the cartel forces repositioned to cut off his escape. The helicopter, too, was being redirected to the ravine. Miguel's hand went to the pocket containing the ledger. If he couldn't break through their cordon, he would need to find a way to get the intelligence to Ortega without being captured himself. But first, he would try one more gambit. Reaching into his jacket, Miguel retrieved the last of his field equipment, a small cylindrical object with a pull-pin, a military-grade smoke grenade designed to create a thick visual barrier in seconds. He'd been saving it as a last resort, and that moment had now arrived. As the cartel helicopter approached the ravine, its spotlight sweeping closer by the second, Miguel made his move. He pulled the pin, threw the grenade upstream where the cartel operators were descending, and then sprinted downstream as fast as the rocky creek bed would allow. Behind him, the grenade erupted in a billowing cloud of dense white smoke that rapidly filled the narrow ravine. The helicopter's spotlight illuminated the smoke from above, creating an impenetrable visual barrier that would buy Miguel precious minutes, his last chance to reach the extraction point before his pursuers closed in. Through the thunder of his own heartbeat and the splash of his boots in the creek, Miguel could hear the confused shouts of the cartel operators behind him. The chaos wouldn't last long. Professional operators would regroup quickly, and the helicopter could simply fly ahead to cut off his escape. But for this brief moment, Miguel had the advantage of confusion, and he intended to use every second of it. The smoke billowed through the ravine, creating a ghostly white corridor that Miguel sprinted through with desperate speed. The creek bed was treacherous. Slippery rocks threatened to twist an ankle with each pounding step, and low-hanging branches clawed at his face and clothing. But fear and adrenaline propelled him forward, his breath coming in controlled bursts as he pushed his aging body to its limits. Behind him, chaos reigned. The cartel radio crackled with overlapping voices as operators struggled to re-establish control of the situation. The helicopter had pulled up, unable to maintain visual contact through the dense smoke. Miguel had perhaps a 2-minute head start. Not much, but it might be enough. The ravine began to widen, its steep walls gradually sloping into more manageable terrain. According to Miguel's mental map, he was now less than half a kilometer from the extraction coordinates. The creek he followed would eventually join a larger stream that ran adjacent to the clearing where Ortega's helicopters would land. As if summoned by his thoughts, the distinctive distant thrum of Black Hawk rotors reached his ears, barely perceptible, but growing steadily louder. The DEA was coming. But so was the cartel helicopter, now repositioning to cut off his escape route. Miguel reached a fork in the creek. Taking the right branch would lead more directly to the extraction point, but would force him into open terrain sooner. The left would provide better cover, but add precious minutes to his journey. With the cartel forces reorganizing behind him and the helicopter searching ahead, neither option was without significant risk. He chose the right fork, prioritizing speed over stealth. As he rounded a bend in the creek, the ravine walls fell away completely, opening into a broader valley. The extraction clearing would be just beyond the next ridgeline. Miguel could see the cartel helicopter hovering near that ridge, its spotlight systematically scanning the forest below. Staying in the creek was no longer an option. It had become too exposed. Miguel veered into the tree line, using the forest for concealment as he paralleled the water's course. The ground here was thick with fallen leaves and soft earth, allowing for quieter movement, but also increasing the risk of leaving traceable signs of passage. The satellite phone vibrated in his pocket. Miguel paused behind the broad trunk of a ceiba tree, using its massive roots as cover while he checked the message. 5 minutes to touchdown. Popping green smoke at LZ. Confirm visual when possible. The Blackhawks were almost here, but Miguel still had to break through the final cartel defensive line to reach them. Ahead, he could see cartel operators deploying along the ridgeline, establishing firing positions overlooking the likely landing zone. The helicopter continued its aerial search pattern, hemming him in from above. Time for one last desperate gambit. Miguel retrieved the cartel radio and took a deep breath. Channeling his decades of military experience, he pressed the transmit button and spoke with the commanding authority of a senior officer. All units, this is Mendoza. Target spotted moving west along the southern ridge. Helicopter, redirect immediately to grid coordinates 047. Ground teams converge from east and north. Move, move, move. It was a calculated risk. If the real Mendoza was monitoring communications, the deception would be exposed immediately. But in the chaos of an active operation, with units spread across difficult terrain in the dark, there was a chance the false order would create enough confusion to work. For several agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then the cartel helicopter banked sharply and headed west, away from Miguel's actual position. Several of the operators on the ridgeline also began to move, responding to what they believed were legitimate orders. Miguel didn't waste the opportunity. With the helicopter temporarily distracted and the ridgeline defense thinned, he sprinted forward, staying low and using all available cover as he advanced. He was halfway up the ridge when a shout rang out. One of the remaining operators had spotted his movement. Gunfire erupted, rounds impacting trees and earth around Miguel as he zigzagged up the slope. There was no more time for stealth. Miguel returned fire with his pistol, not aiming to hit but to force the cartel operators into cover. Then he ran flat out, abandoning any pretense of tactical movement in favor of raw speed. Cresting the ridge, Miguel was greeted by the welcome sight of green smoke billowing from a small clearing approximately 200 meters ahead. Through the trees, he could make out the massive shapes of two Black Hawk helicopters descending, their rotors churning the smoke into swirling patterns. But between him and salvation lay open ground, a gauntlet he would have to run under fire from the cartel operators now in pursuit. Taking a deep breath, Miguel broke from the tree line and sprinted across the exposed terrain. Behind him, shouts and gunfire erupted as the cartel forces realized their quarry was escaping. Bullets kicked up dirt at his feet and whizzed past his head, but he didn't slow, didn't look back. 50 meters from the closest helicopter, Miguel saw black-clad DEA operators deploying from the aircraft, establishing a defensive perimeter. They spotted him immediately, covering his approach with suppressive fire directed at his pursuers. "Friendly coming in," Miguel shouted as he closed the distance, identifying himself to prevent friendly fire incidents. "Cover him!" a DEA team leader bellowed, and a wall of covering fire erupted from the American operators, forcing the cartel forces to take cover. Miguel's lungs burned, his legs threatened to buckle, but the helicopter loomed larger with each stride. 20 meters, 10, 5. Strong hands grabbed him, practically lifting him off his feet as DEA operators pulled him the final distance into the helicopter. He collapsed onto the metal floor of the aircraft, gasping for breath as the door gunners continued to lay down suppressive fire. "Package secured!" someone shouted over the roar of the rotors. "Take off! Take off!" The helicopter lurched as it began to ascend, the sudden G-forces pressing Miguel into the floor. Through the open door, he could see the second Black Hawk also lifting off, its miniguns blazing to keep the cartel forces pinned down during the extraction. A figure knelt beside Miguel, a man in DEA tactical gear with the name Reynolds stenciled on his chest plate. "You Reyes?" the man shouted over the engine noise. Miguel nodded, still struggling to catch his breath. "The ledger. You got it?" Miguel reached into his jacket and withdrew the leather-bound book, its cover now sodden with creek water and sweat. Reynolds took it reverently, as if handling a holy relic, and secured it in a waterproof evidence bag. "Ortega was right about you," Reynolds said, a look of newfound respect in his eyes. "Said you'd get the job done no matter what." Miguel managed a weak smile. "Tell Ortega he owes me a new barn." As the helicopter gained altitude, Miguel pulled himself up to look out the door. Below, the cartel helicopter had returned, hovering impotently as the Blackhawks climbed beyond its operational ceiling. His farm was visible in the distance, the smoldering remains of his barn a glowing ember in the darkness. Home. Or it had been. Miguel knew he couldn't return there now, not after tonight. The cartel would never forget what he had done, never stop hunting the man who had cost them so dearly. Reynolds seemed to read his thoughts. "Don't worry about your place. We've got a team securing it now, collecting evidence, and your animals are being taken care of." "The Jaguars?" Miguel asked, suddenly remembering the big cats he'd released. Reynolds looked confused. "What Jaguars?" Miguel waved the question away. The mother and her cubs were likely miles away by now, reclaiming their freedom in the vast Colombian wilderness. At least something good had come from this night of violence and destruction. As the helicopters leveled off and set course for their base, Reynolds handed Miguel a canteen of water, which he drank from gratefully. "So what happens now?" Miguel asked, returning the canteen. "Now? Now you get debriefed. That ledger you recovered, it's big. Bigger than you can imagine. Names, dates, locations, everything we need to roll up multiple cartel operations across 3 countries. You've just handed us the biggest intelligence windfall in DEA history." Miguel nodded slowly. "And Project Jaguar? The undercover operatives?" Reynolds looked surprised. "Ortega told you about that? Enough to know what was at stake." The DEA agent leaned back against the helicopter's interior wall. "Those agents owe you their lives. If that ledger had fallen into cartel hands..." He let the sentence hang unfinished, the implication clear enough. Miguel stared out at the night sky, watching as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon. After 7 years of seeking peace and quiet, he had been thrust back into the world of violence and intrigue he'd tried to leave behind. And yet, strangely, he felt more alive than he had in years. "There's something else you should know," Reynolds said, interrupting Miguel's thoughts. "Those weren't just any Jaguar cubs you rescued. According to Mendoza's initial interrogation, they were part of a specialized breeding program. The cartel has been experimenting with using trained predators to guard remote drug processing facilities." Miguel raised an eyebrow. "Trained Jaguars? Is that even possible?" Reynolds shrugged. "They've had some success with it, apparently. Jaguars are intelligent, and cubs raised from birth can develop bonds with human handlers. It's sick, but effective. Who's going to try to raid a lab guarded by apex predators? The revelation added yet another layer to the night's strange events. What had begun as a simple act of compassion, saving endangered animals from poachers, had cascaded into something far more complex and far-reaching. As the helicopters continued their journey toward the rising sun, Miguel closed his eyes, exhaustion finally overtaking him. But even as he drifted toward sleep, one thought remained clear in his mind. His life would never be the same again. The DEA forward operating base looked like any other military installation in Colombia. Concrete barriers, razor wire, camouflage netting stretched over key areas to minimize aerial observation. The Black Hawks touched down on a reinforced landing pad, rotors slowly winding down as medical personnel and intelligence officers converged on the aircraft. Miguel was whisked from the helicopter to a medical tent, where a brisk but thorough examination confirmed what he already knew: exhaustion, minor contusions, mild hypothermia from his time in the creek, but nothing life-threatening. The medics provided dry clothing, which Miguel gratefully changed into while sipping a cup of hot, sweet coffee. He had just finished dressing when Colonel Carlos Ortega entered the tent. Though it had been 7 years since they'd last met, Miguel recognized his former commander immediately. Ortega had aged, his dark hair now streaked with silver, new lines etched around his eyes, but he still carried himself with the same rigid military bearing. "Miguel," Ortega said, extending his hand, "it's good to see you, though I wish it were under better circumstances." Miguel accepted the handshake. "Carlos, you're looking well. And you look like hell." A ghost of a smile crossed Ortega's face before his expression turned serious again. "But you did something remarkable tonight. That ledger, it's even more valuable than we initially thought." "So I gathered. Your DEA friends seem quite excited." Ortega glanced over his shoulder, then lowered his voice. "This isn't just a DEA matter anymore. The information in that ledger has implications for intelligence agencies across multiple countries. We have people flying in from Langley as we speak. CIA involvement. The situation was escalating by the hour." "Walk with me," Ortega said, gesturing toward the tent entrance. "There are some things you need to know, and I'd prefer to discuss them where we're less likely to be overheard." Outside, the first rays of sunlight were breaking over the eastern mountains, bathing the base in a golden glow that belied the tense activity taking place. Personnel moved with purpose between buildings, and additional security measures were visibly being implemented. Extra guards at checkpoints, increased perimeter patrols. Ortega led Miguel to a quiet corner of the base, a small garden area set aside for personnel to decompress. At this early hour, it was deserted. "Project Jaguar began 3 years ago," Ortega said without preamble once they were seated on a bench. "A joint operation between Colombian intelligence, the DEA, and the CIA. The objective was to place deep cover operatives within the leadership structures of major cartels across South and Central America." "Dangerous work," Miguel commented. "Extremely. These aren't short-term undercover assignments. These operatives have spent years building identities, gaining trust, working their way into positions of influence. Some have been forced to participate in cartel activities to maintain their covers." Miguel understood the implications, meaning they've technically committed crimes in the course of their duties. "Precisely. Crimes that would result in lengthy prison sentences if their true roles were ever exposed in the wrong way." Ortega sighed heavily. "Which is why that ledger was so dangerous in cartel hands. It doesn't just contain code names and locations. It includes details of operations, contacts, the entire communication network. How did such sensitive information end up in a field ledger carried by someone like Mendoza?" Ortega's expression darkened. "That's the troubling part. Mendoza shouldn't have had access to this information at all. He's middle management at best, handles logistics, some financial operations, but he's not senior enough to be privy to this level of intelligence. Unless someone higher up provided it to him, which suggests a security breach at the highest levels of Project Jaguar. The implications were staggering. If a senior cartel figure with access to Project Jaguar intelligence had gone rogue, dozens of undercover operatives could be at risk. The Jaguar Cubs, Miguel said suddenly. Mendoza said they were part of a training program to guard drug labs, but that seems like a cover story. Why would he personally oversee such a minor operation? Ortega nodded, following Miguel's train of thought. It doesn't add up. Mendoza's presence, the encrypted ledger, the rapid response force sent to recover both. There's something larger at play. The question is what? Before Ortega could respond, a young DEA agent approached, his expression urgent. "Colonel, sir, you're needed in the command center immediately. We've got movement at multiple cartel locations." Ortega stood. "Stay here, I'll be back." But Miguel had no intention of being sidelined. He followed Ortega and the agent to a nondescript building at the center of the base. Inside, what appeared to be a simple administrative office from the exterior revealed itself as a sophisticated command center. Multiple screens displayed satellite imagery, communication intercepts, and real-time surveillance feeds. Reynolds, the DEA agent from the helicopter, was directing operations, pointing to various displays as he issued orders to his team. He looked up as Ortega and Miguel entered. "Sir, we've got a situation developing. Multiple cartel compounds are being evacuated simultaneously. Personnel, equipment, everything. They're burning files, wiping hard drives, going completely dark." "They know," Miguel said, drawing all eyes in the room to him. "They know the ledger's been compromised." Reynolds nodded grimly. "That's our assessment. But the scale of the response is unprecedented. We're seeing coordination between groups that historically have been rivals. Someone's orchestrating this." Ortega moved to examine one of the satellite feeds, which showed vehicles being loaded at a remote compound. "How many Project Jaguar operatives do we have in these locations?" "At least 7 that we can confirm," Reynolds replied. "We've been trying to make contact, implement emergency extraction protocols, but so far only 2 have responded." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. 5 undercover agents, possibly already compromised, possibly already dead. "Show me Mendoza's interrogation," Ortega said suddenly. "I want to see exactly what he said about those Jaguar Cubs." Reynolds directed one of his analysts to pull up the video. On a side screen, Mendoza appeared, looking considerably less composed than when Miguel had last seen him. The cartel handler sat handcuffed to a metal table, his expensive clothing rumpled and stained. "Just a side project," Mendoza was saying in response to a question. "The breeding program has been ongoing for years. Jaguars are territorial, trainable if raised from cubs, perfect for securing remote locations." "And who authorized this program?" The off-camera interrogator's voice was professionally neutral. "It came from the top. Direct order from El Aguila himself." Miguel glanced at Ortega, who had gone very still at the mention of the name. "Who is El Aguila?" Miguel asked quietly. "The Eagle," Reynolds translated unnecessarily. "It's a code name for Alejandro Vasquez, the leader of the Sinaloa faction operating in southern Colombia. He's been on our most wanted list for years, but no one's ever gotten close to him. He's a ghost. He's also," Ortega added grimly, "one of the primary targets of Project Jaguar. We have an operative in his inner circle, or we did." On the screen, the interrogator pressed Mendoza further. "And why were you personally overseeing this operation? Isn't that unusual for someone at your level?" A flicker of something, fear perhaps, crossed Mendoza's face before he composed himself. "I was simply following orders. The Cubs are valuable. El Aguila wanted someone he trusted to ensure their safe delivery." "He's lying," Miguel said, studying Mendoza's body language. or at least not telling the whole truth. Reynolds nodded. Our interrogators thought the same, but he's sticking to his story. What about the ledger? Ortega asked. Has it been fully decrypted? Working on it now. Some of the entries use a complex cipher. Our cryptographers say it might take several more hours to break it completely. Ortega rubbed his temples, a rare display of stress from the normally composed officer. We don't have hours. If there's a breach in Project Jaguar, every minute counts. A communications officer interrupted, handing Reynolds a message. The DEA agent read it quickly, his expression growing even more grave. Sir, we just intercepted a communication between known cartel affiliates. They're putting out a hit order, $5 million USD for the capture of Miguel Reyes, alive if possible. All eyes turned to Miguel. That's flattering, I suppose, he said dryly, though the news sent a chill through him. That kind of bounty would attract every mercenary, hitman, and would-be entrepreneur in Colombia. His face would be plastered across every cartel-controlled territory within hours. This isn't just about revenge, Ortega said thoughtfully. They want to know what you know, what you might have seen or heard during your time with the ledger. I barely had time to glance at it before the shooting started, Miguel pointed out. They don't know that. From their perspective, you potentially had hours with highly sensitive intelligence. You're now a primary threat. Reynolds was already issuing orders. I want a full protection detail assigned to Reyes immediately, and prepare for potential transfer to a secure location outside Colombia. Miguel felt a surge of frustration. I didn't sign up to be placed in protective custody. You signed up the moment you decided to rescue those Jaguar cubs, Ortega replied, not unkindly. And now you're in deeper than any of us anticipated. Before Miguel could respond, another analyst called out from across the room. Sir, we've got something from the ledger decryption. There's a section that doesn't match the cipher patterns of the other entries. It appears to be... Well, sir, it looks like a kill list. Reynolds and Ortega moved quickly to the analyst's station. Miguel followed, an uneasy feeling growing in the pit of his stomach. The screen displayed a page from the ledger, now partially translated. Unlike the operational details and code names that filled most pages, this one contained a simple list of names, 15 in all. Next to each name was a date and a single word: eliminated. These are all Project Jaguar operatives, Reynolds said, his voice barely above a whisper. Operatives we thought were still active or had been lost due to normal operational hazards. Ortega's face had gone ashen. This isn't just a security breach. It's a systematic purge. As the implications sank in, Miguel noticed something else. A name at the bottom of the list, one without the eliminated designation beside it. Instead, it bore a different notation. In progress. The name was Carlos Ortega. The command center erupted into controlled chaos. Reynolds immediately ordered a security lockdown of the entire base, while other agents began urgent verification of all personnel credentials. Ortega was quickly moved to a secure room, surrounded by trusted DEA operators. Miguel found himself unceremoniously dragged along, his status as a key witness and potential target suddenly elevating his importance. This is Protocol Blackout, Reynolds explained as they hurried through the base. Complete communication shutdown except through pre-established secure channels. No one enters or leaves until we verify everyone's identity. Inside the secure room, essentially a fortified bunker buried beneath the main command center, Ortega paced like a caged jaguar, his military discipline temporarily fractured by the revelation that he was on a cartel hit list. It doesn't make sense, he muttered, more to himself than to Miguel or the DEA agents. My role in Project Jaguar was known only to a handful of people with the highest security clearances. Even most of the operatives didn't know I was their ultimate handler. Which means the leak is at the highest level, Reynolds said grimly. Someone with full access to the program. Miguel watched the exchange silently, his mind racing. Something still didn't add up about the entire operation. The Jaguar cubs, Mendoza's personal involvement, the elaborate security measures for what had initially appeared to be a simple animal smuggling operation. "I need to speak with Mendoza again," Miguel said suddenly. Reynolds looked skeptical. "Our best interrogators have been working on him for hours. What do you think you can get that they couldn't?" "A different perspective. You've been asking him about cartel operations, Project Jaguar, intelligence breaches. I want to ask him about Jaguars." Ortega, who had been staring at a tactical map on the wall, turned to face Miguel. "The Cubs, you think they're significant beyond being a cover story?" "I think nothing about this operation has been what it seemed. Mendoza is a financial specialist, not a wildlife smuggler. His presence at that camp was unusual, as was the level of security for a few Jaguar cubs, even valuable ones. There's something we're missing." Reynolds hesitated, then nodded to one of his subordinates. "Bring Mendoza here. Maximum security protocols." While they waited, Miguel studied the partial decryption of the ledger displayed on a secure tablet. Beyond the kill list, much of the content remained encoded, but certain patterns were emerging. Regular payments to entities identified only by code names, references to genetic materials and biological assets, shipping routes that didn't align with known drug trafficking corridors. "This isn't just about drugs or undercover operatives," Miguel said, looking up from the tablet. "There's something else going on." Before anyone could respond, the door opened, and Mendoza was brought in, heavily shackled and flanked by 4 armed guards. The cartel handler looked considerably worse for wear, his designer clothes now rumpled and stained, his carefully groomed appearance disheveled from hours of interrogation. But his eyes remained sharp, calculating as they swept the room, lingering momentarily on Ortega before settling on Miguel. "The farmer," Mendoza said, his voice hoarse but still carrying that edge of condescension. "I must congratulate you on your unexpected skills. My employers are quite interested in making your acquaintance again." "I'm sure they are," Miguel replied evenly. $5 million is a flattering bounty." A flicker of surprise crossed Mendoza's face before he masked it. "News travels fast." "Not fast enough, apparently. Tell me about the Jaguars, Mendoza. The real story, not the cover about training them to guard drug labs." Mendoza's expression remained neutral, but Miguel noticed a subtle tension in his shoulders. "I've already explained that operation to your colleagues. It's hardly a secret." "Then explain why a financial specialist was personally overseeing it. Explain why El Aguila would commit significant resources to transport a few cubs. Explain the connection to Project Jaguar." At the mention of the project name, Mendoza's composure slipped just slightly, a tightening around the eyes, a momentary stillness in his breathing. Tells that might have gone unnoticed by someone without Miguel's training. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mendoza said, but the denial lacked conviction. Miguel leaned forward. "The mother Jaguar. She was sedated but alive. Why keep her alive if the cubs were the only valuable assets? Training cubs doesn't require the mother. In fact, it's counterproductive." Reynolds and Ortega exchanged glances, clearly not having considered this angle before. "The biological assets mentioned in the ledger," Miguel continued, pressing his advantage. "They're not drugs, are they? It's something to do with the Jaguars themselves." Mendoza's mask finally cracked. A bitter laugh escaped him, tinged with what sounded almost like desperation. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into, farmer. No idea what forces you're now aligned against." He glanced at Ortega and Reynolds. "And neither do your new friends, apparently." "Enlighten us, then," Ortega said, speaking for the first time since Mendoza's arrival. Mendoza seemed to consider his options, calculating as always. Finally he shrugged, the gesture incongruous with his shackled state. "The Jaguar program isn't about training guard animals. It's about genetics, specifically their DNA." The The room fell silent as the implications of this statement settled over everyone present. "Explain," Reynolds demanded. "Jaguars possess unique biological properties. Their enzyme systems can metabolize certain compounds that would be toxic to most mammals. El Águila has been funding research to isolate and potentially synthesize these enzymes for pharmaceutical purposes." "Pharmaceutical," Miguel repeated skeptically. "You mean drug manufacturing?" "Not in the way you think," Mendoza countered. "This isn't about cocaine or heroin. It's about something potentially far more valuable. A new class of drugs entirely, ones that could pass undetected through conventional screening methods because they're biologically derived rather than chemically synthesized." Reynolds cursed softly. "Designer drugs based on Jaguar DNA, undetectable by current methods. The market potential would be billions," Mendoza finished. "Enough to transform a cartel into a legitimate pharmaceutical empire overnight. The ultimate laundering operation." "And Project Jaguar?" Ortega pressed. "How does that connect?" Mendoza's eyes narrowed. "That's where things get interesting, Colonel. Your precious intelligence operation was compromised from the beginning, not by a leak, but by design. El Águila needed to ensure his research remained hidden from international authorities. What better cover than to allow a controlled intelligence operation to infiltrate his organization? Feed them enough legitimate intelligence to maintain their credibility while keeping the real operation completely separate." The bombshell landed with devastating force. Project Jaguar, the cornerstone of anti-cartel operations across 3 countries, had been compromised from its inception, a puppet show orchestrated by the very targets it was meant to bring down. "You're saying we've been played for years," Reynolds said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Masterfully," Mendoza agreed, a hint of professional admiration in his tone. "But then something unexpected happened. One of your operatives, deeper and more capable than anticipated, actually penetrated the inner circle, discovered the Jaguar research, and began feeding real intelligence back to Project Jaguar leadership." "Which operative?" Ortega demanded. Mendoza smiled thinly. "That would be telling. But I will say this. Their cover identity was so convincing that even El Águila trusted them implicitly, until recently." Miguel studied Mendoza carefully, noting the calculated way he was parceling out information. Enough to seem cooperative without revealing anything truly damaging. "The kill list," Miguel said. "Those weren't just compromised agents, were they? They were people who got too close to the truth about the Jaguar program." "Very good, Farmer," Mendoza said with mock applause. "El Águila doesn't tolerate threats to his vision. Anyone who learned about the program's true nature became a liability." "And the ledger?" Reynolds asked. "Why would you be carrying something so incriminating?" For the first time, genuine concern flickered across Mendoza's face. That was not supposed to happen. The ledger was being transported to a more secure location following the recent security breach. I was trusted to personally oversee its transfer, along with the latest biological samples, the cubs and their mother. Miguel suddenly understood. You weren't just transporting the Jaguar family, you were delivering them to a research facility. The mother's genetic makeup had proven particularly valuable, Mendoza confirmed. Her cubs were to be the next generation of the program. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. But one crucial question remained unanswered. Who betrayed Project Jaguar? Ortega asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Who put my name on that kill list? Mendoza looked directly at Ortega, then at Reynolds, and finally at Miguel. His expression was no longer calculating or condescending, but genuinely apprehensive. The same person who ensured I would be captured with the ledger, the same person who orchestrated this entire scenario to force exactly this confrontation. He took a deep breath. Someone in this very room. The room froze in sudden paralytic tension. Every eye darted from person to person, years of training and instinct transforming trusted colleagues into potential threats in an instant. Reynolds' hand drifted toward his sidearm, while Ortega's posture subtly shifted to a defensive stance. The DEA guards tightened their grips on their weapons, uncertain who they might need to use them against. "Enough games, Mendoza," Ortega growled. "Names. Now." Mendoza's lips curved into a thin smile. "Consider the evidence. Who has positioned themselves at the center of this investigation? Who has had access to the ledger since its recovery? Who conveniently rescued it from cartel hands?" All eyes shifted to Miguel. "That's absurd," Miguel said, fighting to keep his voice calm despite the rising anger. "I stumbled onto your operation by accident. I was trying to save the Jaguars." "A convenient cover story," Mendoza countered, "just as your simple farmer persona has been for years. Tell me, did El Aguila recruit you before or after you left the military?" Reynolds studied Miguel with newfound suspicion. "You did have sole possession of the ledger for several hours, during which I was being hunted through the jungle by cartel killers," Miguel pointed out. "If I were working for them, why would they try to kill me?" "A calculated risk to establish your credibility," Mendoza suggested. "The bounty on your head. Perhaps it's not for your capture, but your extraction." The accusation hung in the air, poisonous and corrosive to the fragile trust that had formed overnight. Miguel could see doubt creeping into Reynolds' expression, calculation in Ortega's eyes, as his old commander reassessed everything. "Check my background," Miguel said, addressing Ortega directly. "You know where I've been, what I've been doing for the past 7 years. I'm exactly who I appear to be, a retired soldier who wanted peace." "Background can be fabricated," Mendoza interjected. "Deep cover operatives often have impeccable legends." Miguel fought to control his growing frustration. This was classic misdirection, a desperate gambit by Mendoza to sow discord among his captors. But why? What advantage could he gain from this chaos? The answer came in a sudden clarifying flash. "He's stalling," Miguel said, cutting through the tension. "This entire accusation is a delay tactic. The question is, what is he waiting for?" Ortega's eyes widened in realization. He turned to Reynolds. "Security sweep, now, full spectrum." Reynolds immediately barked orders into his radio. Within seconds, alarms blared across the base. "Perimeter breach in Sector 7. Multiple hostiles." Mendoza's expression shifted from calculated manipulation to genuine surprise. Whatever he had been anticipating, this wasn't it. That reaction told Miguel everything he needed to know. "It's not me," Miguel said firmly. "And it's not Mendoza's doing either. He's as surprised as we are." Reynolds' radio crackled with urgent updates. "At least 30 heavily armed combatants approaching from the North Ridge. They've already neutralized 2 observation posts." "Cartel forces?" Ortega asked. Reynolds shook his head after listening to another report. "Negative. These are military-grade operators. Professional equipment, coordinated approach tactics." "Private military contractors," Miguel suggested. "Hired by the cartel, but not cartel themselves." "Get Mendoza to a secure holding area," Ortega ordered the guards, "and maintain the lockdown on the decrypted intelligence. No one accesses it without direct authorization from both Agent Reynolds and myself." As the guards moved to escort Mendoza from the room, the cartel handler locked eyes with Miguel one last time. "You still don't see it, do you? You're all missing the obvious." Before Miguel could respond, Mendoza was gone, hustled away under heavy guard. The room immediately transitioned to combat preparations, with Reynolds coordinating defense positions, while Ortega conferred with base security. In the sudden flurry of activity, Miguel found himself momentarily forgotten, an outside observer as the military and law enforcement machinery sprang into action around him. This operational blind spot, gave him a unique perspective, allowing him to observe dynamics and interactions others were too busy to notice. Like the way Reynolds had positioned himself to maintain line of sight to all exits, or how his hand kept returning to check a secure pocket in his tactical vest, or most tellingly, how his responses to the radio reports were just slightly delayed, as if he were processing information he already knew. Miguel caught Ortega's eye and gave a subtle nod toward Reynolds. Years of working together had forged a silent communication between them, and Ortega immediately understood. His expression betrayed nothing as he casually repositioned himself to flank the DEA agent. "Reynolds," Ortega said conversationally, "I need to access the secure comms to contact Bogota headquarters. Your authorization code?" "Of course, Colonel." Reynolds turned toward the communications terminal, and in that moment of distraction, Miguel moved. Years of combat training took over as Miguel closed the distance in 2 swift strides. His first strike targeted Reynolds' right arm, preventing him from drawing his weapon. The second was a precise blow to the throat, not enough to cause permanent damage, but sufficient to incapacitate. Reynolds crumpled, gasping, as Ortega swiftly relieved him of his sidearm. "How long have you known?" Miguel asked, securing Reynolds' hands with the agent's own zip ties. "I haven't," Ortega admitted, but something felt wrong about his responses from the beginning. Too controlled, too prepared. Your signal confirmed my suspicions. A quick search of Reynolds revealed a small encrypted satellite phone hidden in his tactical vest, not standard DEA issue and not logged in any equipment manifest. "The attack outside," Miguel said. "It's not aimed at capturing Mendoza or the Ledger. It's an extraction operation," Ortega finished, "for Reynolds himself. The mercenaries outside weren't trying to breach the base. They were creating a diversion to allow Reynolds to escape with critical intelligence. The perfect cover for the real traitor to disappear in the chaos." Ortega immediately issued new orders, redirecting security to internal threats while simultaneously establishing a new defensive perimeter. Miguel, meanwhile, conducted a more thorough search of Reynolds, discovering a miniaturized data drive cleverly concealed in a modified ammunition magazine. "He copied the decrypted portions of the ledger," Miguel said, holding up the tiny device, "including the names of any remaining undercover operatives." Reynolds, still gasping from the throat strike, managed a bitter laugh. "You have no idea what you're interrupting. Years of work, millions of dollars." "Who turned you?" Ortega demanded. "Was it El Águila?" Reynolds shook his head. "El Águila is just another player. The Jaguar program. It's bigger than cartels. Think pharmaceutical companies, government bioweapons research, entities that make cartels look like street gangs." The implications were staggering. Corporate and potentially state actors using cartel operations as cover for advanced biomedical research, with billions in potential profits at stake. "Project Jaguar was never just about infiltrating cartels, was it?" Miguel asked. "It was about accessing this research." "The perfect cover," Reynolds confirmed, his breathing gradually normalizing. "Intelligence agencies get their drug busts and headlines, while the real operation continues unimpeded." Outside, the sounds of combat were intensifying. The mercenary force, realizing their extraction target wasn't coming, had shifted tactics to a more aggressive assault. The base's defenses were holding, but the situation remained precarious. Ortega secured Reynolds to a fixed position, ensuring the traitor couldn't escape in the confusion. "Stay with him," he instructed Miguel. "I need to coordinate our defense." As Ortega left, Miguel studied Reynolds with a mixture of disgust and curiosity. All this, the corruption, the betrayal, the deaths of undercover agents, for what? Money? Reynolds met his gaze without shame. "You've lived your life in service, Reyes. First to your country, then to your principles. What has it gotten you? A burned-down farm and a death sentence from the cartels. I chose differently." The base shuddered as an explosion hit somewhere near the perimeter. But even as the battle raged outside, Miguel felt a strange sense of clarity. His simple act of compassion, saving a Jaguar family from captivity, had cascaded into exposing a conspiracy that spanned continents and crossed the boundaries between criminal enterprises, corporations, and governments. Hours later, as DEA reinforcements secured the base and drove off the remaining mercenaries, Miguel stood with Ortega on a hilltop overlooking the facility. The morning sun had fully risen, illuminating the lush Colombian landscape that had been his home for 7 years. "What happens now?" Miguel asked. "The investigation will expand," Ortega replied. "Reynolds wasn't the only corrupted official. We'll need to rebuild Project Jaguar from the ground up, with stricter compartmentalization and oversight." "And the Jaguar program? The genetic research?" "That intelligence has already been forwarded to specialized units. If these corporations are developing undetectable drugs using Jaguar DNA, they've violated dozens of international laws. The fallout will be significant." Miguel nodded, then asked the question that had been weighing on him since the night began. "And me? What becomes of the farmer who stumbled into all this?" Ortega turned to face him fully. "That depends on the farmer. You could enter witness protection, start a new life somewhere far from Colombia. Or you could come back in. Your skills haven't diminished, Miguel. If anything, they've been sharpened by your time away. We need people like you, people whose loyalty is to the truth, not to power or money." Miguel gazed out at the mountains where, somewhere, a Jaguar mother and her cubs were reclaiming their freedom. His farm was gone, his peaceful existence shattered. But in its place was a renewed sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. "I'll need some time to think about it," he said finally. Ortega nodded in understanding. "Take all the time you need. But whatever you decide, remember this. By saving those Jaguar cubs, you likely saved dozens of lives and exposed a conspiracy that threatened the integrity of international law enforcement. Not bad for a simple farmer." As they walked back toward the base, Miguel smiled for the first time since the ordeal began. "I wonder what happened to those cubs." As if in answer, a helicopter pilot approached them with an urgent report. A mother Jaguar and 5 cubs had been spotted near a village 10 kilometers away. The locals were requesting assistance. Miguel and Ortega exchanged a glance. "Well," Miguel said, "it would be irresponsible to leave dangerous predators so close to a village." "Absolutely," Ortega agreed with the ghost of a smile. "This sounds like a job requiring specialized expertise." As they boarded a helicopter to investigate the Jaguar sighting, Miguel felt the weight of the past 24 hours begin to lift. His life had been irrevocably changed, but perhaps change wasn't always something to be feared. Sometimes it was exactly what was needed.